I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Another election in the bag, and all the votes are still being counted in some areas. And joining us to talk about some of the dynamics in Washington State is Olympia correspondent Austin Jenkins. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
Nice to be back, Scott.
So because the vote count, of course, is still coming in some counties, we're not going to focus too much on things that are outstanding. We're going to focus on things that we know and things that we can talk about going forward. So that being said, Governor Jay Inslee seems to have been elected to a rare third term. And the dynamics of that race, of course, were very interesting going into this year. Is it pretty much shaking out the way you expected, Austin?
Yeah, it is, because you've got a well-known governor, a Democrat in the state that leans Democrat, up against a first-time candidate in Loren Culp, who was not well known. Just looking at the split, it's essentially a 60-40 race. On the one hand, you could see that as a blowout. You could also say to yourself, well, for a guy who wasn't well known and hadn't ever run before, Loren Culp is getting more than 40% of the vote. So, maybe that's not a bad performance, at least given where he was starting out. And really what's kind of interesting to note is that, and again, as you're mentioning, the final votes aren't in yet, so these are fluctuating a little bit, but he's really only about 4 points off of where Bill Bryant was 4 years ago. Bill Bryant was the Republican candidate for governor in 2016.
So as those vote counts are still coming in, you're right, the margins might change a little bit, but probably not expected to swing in any significant manner. But Loren Culp has not conceded as we tape this a couple of days after the election, has brought up what he thinks are quote unquote irregularities, whatever that really means in his mind, and has sort of said it's not over yet. And what have state election officials said in response to that?
Yeah, well, let's contrast that with the fact that the Associated Press called this race almost the moment the polls closed, or 8 o'clock rolled around. So it was, from their perspective, a very definitive race, and a 60-40 split is, be a miracle to sort of somehow close that gap, even if, and I think we kind of expect this, the later arriving votes to benefit Republican candidates, because there's a sense that Democrats voted early this year. But yeah, he's making very vague references to something looking fishy or seeming fishy about this, even using the word corruption. There's no evidence of that. The governor yesterday, or this week, said that he thought that was very irresponsible talk. The Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, a Republican, said there's no evidence of irregularities. And again, Culp hasn't been specific about this. What he has said is he wants to let all the votes be counted. And I think that that's a defensible position. You can certainly, there are still outstanding votes to count. So he's not conceding at this point. He wants to see where things land in the end. And we'll see counting going on for some number of days.
Well, speaking of Mr. Culp, though, he has, of course, a full-time job, or at least had a full-time job in the city of Republic in Ferry County as the police chief and the sole law enforcement officer for the town, until it seems that the city has gotten rid of its police department, a very small one, of course. What's going on there? That seemed to kind of come out of nowhere right after the election.
Yeah, kind of a 1-2 punch for Loren Culp, not winning the governor's race and then losing his job. And he announced this to supporters in a Facebook Live appearance this week. Turns out, I guess, that the city council at the end of October voted, as you say, to eliminate the police department. And since he is the police department, the chief and the sole officer, eliminate his position. He says he had taken a leave of absence and the local sheriff's office was backfilling. Now it looks like the city is contracting with the sheriff's office going forward for law enforcement, and Culp is out of a job. I did see some reporting that suggests perhaps he would be able to lateral over into the sheriff's office there. He didn't reference that. He described it as a knife in the back. He said that the timing was suspicious. He urged his supporters to call and complain to the city of Republic. He did not appear to be taking this well. He said he got really no notification and no thanks for your service, but instead, again, to use his language, it felt kind of like a knife in the back.
Right. And we should just point out, for those who are unfamiliar, the Ferry County Sheriff's Office is headquartered in the small town of Republic. Republic is the largest town in Ferry County. It's only a few thousand people, though. And it's not uncommon for sheriff's departments to provide policing services in smaller towns in those counties, because the cities don't maybe have the budget to have their own police department. So it's not an uncommon thing. So
We
let's
even
move
see
on
that
from
over
that.
here in King County with, King County Sheriff's Office doing police services for local municipalities.
Sure. So speaking of Kim Wyman, you mentioned her as the elected Secretary of State who oversees elections, but she herself was up for election. And it looks like it's possible she might be the only statewide Republican official left standing in Washington state after this election. And so I wonder if you think that this year was an anomaly in terms of because of President Trump being on the ballot and that motivating a lot of Democrats in the state or people Democratic leaning to come out and vote, and Republicans might just be sort of swept up in that? Or is this a larger trend in Washington state that Kim Wyman might be the very, very rare statewide elected Republican going forward?
Yeah, I believe she may be the only statewide Republican left standing on the entire West Coast here in the lower 48 when all is said and done, because of Oregon voters apparently electing a Democrat to the Secretary of State's office in that state. So yes, I think that Republicans are an endangered species when it comes to statewide office here. And, part of what happened this year is because Inslee was running for a third term and it wasn't an open seat, that was a disincentive for some better known Republicans to jump into the race. Somebody that comes to mind would be Pierce County Executive Bruce Danmeyer, who has often been talked about as a potential candidate for a higher office, even House Republican leader J.T. Wilcox. So, next time there's an open seat, I think we might see more competitive Republicans get into this. But the problem Republicans have right now is that they don't really seem to have a path to win unless they can inspire ticket splitting, which is what Kim Wyman seems to be doing. They've lost the suburbs around King County and really the Puget Sound suburbs. They are gaining some traction out on the coast, but they're not making inroads with the voters that used to help them get elected to statewide office. And whether they can retool as a party and put forth a candidate that can appeal more broadly really remains to be seen. It's pointed out to me that Republicans win in states like Massachusetts, but that's also a different dynamic. It's a different voter population. Republicans really haven't been able to figure out a way to win back the governor's office, and we're going on 4 decades here.
So that's statewide office, but of course in the state legislature there are Republicans, and many of them, in fact. What are some of the dynamics playing out in the state legislature races this year that might be of interest?
Yeah, so those are still shaking out. I think Democrats will probably be up a little bit, maybe a seat in the Senate, maybe a couple seats in the House. We're just going to have to see kind of where things land, because there are some super close races, but a couple of places that I'm watching that I think are interesting. Democrats may be able to flip a seat down in Clark County in Southwest Washington this time around. And that's interesting just because that is a fast growing area. It has been fairly favorable and friendly to Republicans, although not exclusively, but that could be a sign of things changing down there, kind of a harbinger, just something to watch. I mentioned a minute ago the coastal Washington, Southwest coastal Washington, the 19th district, where it appears that 2 incumbent Democrats, a state senator and a state House member, have been washed out to sea, so to speak, by a real switch there, a shift to Republicans that we started to see 4 years ago. So kind of a blue collar, more rural environment that long went for Democrats, but now is becoming much more red. If you move north from there, Pierce County, there's an opportunity for Democrats to pick up a seat in Pierce County and to elect the first Black state senator in a decade. That race is still pretty tight, but it looking promising for Democrats. And then moving up to the north part of the western part of the state, the northwestern part of the state, Whatcom County and the area around Whidbey Island, showing some promise for Democrats, some pretty tight races in Whidbey Island right now, or a tight Senate race. But it looks like Democrats are being able to make some incursions into areas that are outside that central Puget Sound region, with the exception of what's going on in coastal Washington.
Okay, so Washington trending blue in statewide elections and possibly in the state legislature. However, everything that you just talked about was west of the Cascades, and anyone who lives east of the Cascades or is just familiar with politics in the state is very understanding of the fact that it's a different story in Eastern Washington. In fact, as it stands coming into this election, there were only 3 Democrats in the state legislature in any state legislative seat east of the Cascades, and they were all from the same district in the most urban core of Spokane. Going into the legislative session, in your experience, how do the Republicans in Eastern Washington, who are a majority, frankly, end up working with the Democrats who control the legislature to really get things done for their residents in Eastern Washington?
Well, I think you raise a really important point, which is that with 49 legislative districts, I think before the election, only 6 of them were divided districts where you had a combination of Democrats and Republicans. So just as the country is very polarized, so is our state. Now, we may be electing Democrats statewide because of where the numbers are, Central Puget Sound, but we've got very blue districts and very red districts, and a lot of those red districts are east of the mountains. And if anything, they're getting more Republican, not less Republican. If Democrats make some gains in terms of seats in the legislature, that obviously diminishes the role of Republicans. So this is a case of, for the Republicans, do they play the role of the loyal opposition, or do they look for opportunities to work with Democrats on certain pieces of legislation? What I often say is that the legislature is kind of an 80-20 proposition. 80% of what they do is fairly bipartisan, and it's not uncommon to see unanimous votes for legislation. It's the 20% where you really see the philosophical differences between the parties reveal themselves, and the differences and the split votes. So Republicans are not in a power position. Their votes are often or sometimes needed if you need 60% to approve bonds, or 2/3 for some reason. Tapping into the rainy day fund, for instance, may take Republican votes. I think that there's some triggers around what's going on with the economy, but generally they're kind of in a position and in a decision-making mode of when do they want to play and be part of the policy making, and when do they think they need to stand up and while they won't be able to stop stuff necessarily, be the voice of opposition.
All right, so going into the next legislative session that starts in 2021, I'm going to ask you to break out the crystal ball just a little bit. There was talk over the summer that there might be a special legislative session because of the coronavirus pandemic and budget issues. That didn't happen. Then talk of maybe there will be a short one quickly after the election. Who knows if that will happen, if you have any insight. But let's just pretend that going into 2021, we're going to have a normal legislative session, even though nothing is really normal at this point. There's going to be a lot of things on the agenda. The pandemic, of course, what that means for the state budget and the response, the actual regular 2-year state budget planning that was going to take place during this legislative session. And then, of course, all the other normal associated issues that come up every year. And then issues with, racial justice issues that need to be addressed by the legislature, those sorts of things. What sort of things are we looking for coming into this legislative session?
Yeah, as you noted, it will be anything but a normal session because much of it will be remote. And some of the details are still being figured out and even being announced this week. So yes, obviously the budget shortfall is going to be top of mind. Continuing to address the COVID crisis and the economic fallout. I can imagine that they'll be looking to spend money in the capital construction budget with the idea of sort of generating some jobs and trying to get some money into the economy. Police reform, with Democrats in charge, the governor and Democratic leaders in the legislature signal that will be a top priority. So we can expect to see a package of police reform measures. I do think that because of COVID and because of remote sessions, this may reduce the volume of bills that get through. I say that now, maybe I'll be surprised later, because the trend line has been more bills, more stuff passing, especially with one party rule. But this may slow things down a little bit, and it may force Democrats to really figure out what their priorities are when they're trying to do legislating in less than ideal circumstances because of the pandemic.
Well, it's good information. We always appreciate you coming on to share your insights. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
Thanks for having me. You're welcome.
You can see more of Austin's reporting and Northwest news and election analysis at our website, NWPB.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.